Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming on the second night of a two-session series that's coming out of Auckland. It gives me great pleasure. Robert Howell has been a strong member of the Fabian's Frat from the get-go in Auckland. I think you were in the audience, Robert, and then it didn't take long before you gave your first Fabian presentation. And I think this might be, is it your second or is it your third? I'm not sure.
Third or fourth.
Oh, wow. Well, there we go. So I'm really pleased to have you back, Robert, and I really appreciate the work and effort that you're putting into the issue that you're raising with us tonight. It's a critical issue and it needs to be pushed, and I appreciate the work you're doing on it. So without further ado, can I welcome you and ask you to present for us. We'll talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A session and work up until, till the end.
Okay, can you see that slide?
Yep.
Okay. So thank you very much, Phil, for the opportunity to present this material. Shall I say that I've been doing a lot of work with Wise Response, which is a group that was started by Alan Mark in Dunedin 10 or so years ago. And it's an electronic network of a whole range of disciplines, but there's a range more towards scientists than others. But they have been advocating some of the issues that I've been suggesting that they pick up on, and I'll talk about those. But I'm not a Wise Response spokesperson. But the material that I present is in the public domain. So, are your funds caring for people in the planet? So there are a number of confusing terms for ethical investment: sustainability, ESG, social responsible, environmentally responsible. There's most probably some others as well. And they're not the same, and there's quite a bit of confusion. If you look at ESG, which stands for Environment, Social and Governance, that comes from the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. But the notion of responsible is never defined in those principles. The Reporting Exchange in 2019 talked about 1,700 different ESG standards with 360 different ESG accounting standards. The Economist has just recently done a feature on this and says ideally the ESG term should be scrapped. If you take the notion of sustainability, sustainable is the ability to be sustainable, ability to be maintained at a certain level or rate or level. It's enduring. So we talk about sustainable fish stock, we talk about a sustainable forest. When we cut a sustainable forest, if you cut trees down, then you make sure that enough are planted to be able to keep that forest going. But we don't talk about sustainable when there's murder going on, or we don't talk about sustainable animal cruelty. We use other terms that are more appropriate for defining the animal cruelty. Animals have a sentient characteristic, means they feel and they think, and we're taking life, and that's the dominant ethical imperative. So sustainable is not the appropriate term to cover all behaviour in the moral domain. It's secondary, not a primary concept. Why is sustainability, why is something that's unsustainable wrong? Well, you have to then dig down there to explain that. So in 2021, towards the end of last year, Wise Response made complaints about Pathfinder, Generate, AMP Wealth and AMP Capital to the Financial Markets Authority. And the Financial Markets Authority took a very long time to respond to that. And eventually when they did, they said, it's not possible for us to decide what values are for Kiwisaver funds because values are subjective and constantly changing. Well, they don't define greenwashing. The Old Testament, murder, stealing, false witness, these are not values that are constantly changing. War crimes in the Ukraine, torture, rape, and so on. These are not just subjective and constantly changing. Slavery and human rights and pollution. So there are real problems in trying to ensure that when people have Kiwisaver, that they're actually properly informed. And part of that is making sure that when the funds claim to be ethical, there is some substance to that. Wise response, you can see at the bottom, in October 2021, we wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister saying, look, we have made these complaints to the Financial Markets Authority. And in addition to that, we've done a very quick survey to show that the large majority of funds, Kiwisaver funds, are invested in banks that invest in the fossil fuel industry. And there are real problems with that. The Prime Minister passed that over to the Minister Clark, Commerce and Affairs, who wrote back and said responsible and ethical mean different things to different people, different standards and priorities. We have taken them on about that because there's a confusion here between defining what is ethical and then prioritizing about what you're doing. It also ignores the notions of equality, opportunity, solidarity, sustainability, and freedom, which are part of the Labour Party manifesto. And one would have thought that the ministers would be actually endorsing what is in the manifesto. First example, simplicity. The core notion of ethical notion for simplicity is that companies cause no harm. And I had done a study of that and looked at it from the point of view of validity and so on. And one of the things that came out was that while the notion was valid, simplicity is invested in JP Morgan Chase. And BankTrack a few years ago did an analysis of the world's 60th biggest banks for over a 5-year period that have invested 3.8 trillion in fossil fuels, and simplicity, Morgan Chase leads the pack in that. Simplicity is invested in it, and yet it claims to do no harm, and that's really quite misleading. This BankTrack study is really quite important. I've given you the top 10 in the graph, but practically all the Kiwisaver funds are invested in at least one of those banks, and they claim to be ethical and they don't identify that. Example for Generate, it's involved in Wells Fargo, and it's involved in Morgan Stanley. They were in the top 10. They are also involved in Bank Central Australia, and the Environmental Paper Network pointed out that Bank Central Australia invests in APP. That's APP. It's a conglomerate connected to 30 years of deforestation, forest and peat fires, destruction of wildlife habitat in 2 million hectares in Indonesia. This is another example with the New Zealand Super Fund, and it's comparing what has been excluded by the Norwegian Council of Ethics. So the Norwegians have an ethical statement, and they have a Council of Ethics that's separate from the actual management of the investment of the funds, and they recommend exclusions. And in 2018, they recommended Walmart be excluded, Ballarat Heavy Electricals, Duke Energy, LJM Corp, palm oil plantations, ZTE, which is a Chinese company, for bribery and corruption in 18 countries, and Potash Corp, Saskatchewan. So that was in 2018. In 2020, the Norwegians has excluded Aerojet Rocketdyne and Airbus SE because they were involved in the production of nuclear weapons. They excluded AGL Energy for coal-based energy. Severe environmental damage, there's two examples there. Serious violation of individual rights in situations of war or conflict and in human rights. And then if you also look at the backtrack evidence, they are invested in Citi, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, Barclays, HSBC, Bank of China, and the Agricultural Bank of China. So these, the figures there are the amount of money over a 5-year period that bank has invested in fossil fuel, the fossil fuel sector. So when we come to the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, the legislation says that they should invest in such a way that avoiding prejudice to New Zealand's reputation as a responsible member of the community should be the ethical principle. In the Council for Socially Responsible Investment conference in 2006, we identified that the New Zealand Super Fund was actually invested in tobacco. And yet a year or two before that, the New Zealand Super Fund had taken legal advice to see whether their investment in tobacco would damage New Zealand's reputation as a responsible investor. And the answer was no. And then a couple of years later, a lady whose name I've forgotten became very active about their investment in Freeport, Moran. And both of these examples were excluded, not on the grounds of the legislation, Clause D, but basically because of public embarrassment. The New Zealand Super Fund interprets its prejudice principle to equal as the same as responsible. And they don't define that, but they talk about it being ESG, but it's undefined. Now, just going back to the Financial Markets Authority, the Financial Markets Authority have decided that they won't act on wise response complaints because values are subjective and constantly changing. That's on one hand. On the other hand, they have issued a code of professional conduct for financial advice services where they use the notions of integrity, fairness, and the need to protect client information. So they're actually in contradiction with their own codes and advice. Plus, they also are in breach of the State Services Commissioner's Code. That code applies to all public entities, Crown entities and employees. So the Wise Response made 2 complaints to the State Services Commission about the breach of Code of Integrity and Conduct by the New Zealand Super Fund and the Financial Markets Authority. The key terms that the State Services Commissioner Code identifies as the principles of integrity, the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, the notion of trustworthiness, avoiding activities, etc., which may harm the reputation of your organisation, and then acting lawfully and objectively. One of the major points we made about the Financial Markets Authority is that if the State Services Commission interpreted these key terms as subjective and open to change and therefore not applicable, then the State Services Commissioner's Code would actually mean nothing. The main complaint about the New Zealand Superannuation Fund is that they're invested in a whole lot of stuff, really, which is quite unethical And that's because they've adopted a ESG framework, which just doesn't define what responsible is. So values, codes of conduct. Values are judgments of worth. They can be personal, but they can also be judgments of public good and safety. So codes are sets of rules describing the values, the standards, the cultural customs, the policies that define acceptable behaviour. Validation. The 4 examples that I quoted earlier were based on an examination of each of those about whether they were valid. That is, does the 2 steps of content and construct. The first step is, does the content validity, does it make sense at a conceptual level? Now, if you take the code of conduct for Auckland Airport, it has a code of conduct that talks about the board of directors responsible for its employees and its staff, but it mentions nothing about their responsibility towards the environment and to the earth. Construct validity requires empirical consideration, so that if you apply that measure, is it consistent with other empirical measure? So if you go to the simplicity on the Wise Response website, there's I believe that's a good case study of the process that one needs to go through. And in section 2.3, I've developed a checklist that has been used to identify whether simplicity uses the notion of harm, and is that valid? And I take you through that analysis, and that process is applicable to any other fund. What we found was the notion of harm is valid for both things, but when it's actually used in practice, it means that simplicity is investing in stuff that's unethical. We did not make that one of the complaints to the Financial Markets Authority, because Sam Stubbs said, look, we rely on Vanguard to a considerable extent to do the work for us. And he wanted time to go and try and persuade them to deal with that stuff. Pathfinder didn't get back to us straight away, so they were one of the complaints. However, about a month or 2 later, they came back and said, we're doing a sustainability report, and we have accepted a number of your criticisms. They were invested in 4 of the 60 banks, and they said, we're going to get rid of our investment in 2 of them. Well, we wrote back and said, why don't you get rid of the whole 4? Now, at the same time, unbeknown to us, Pathfinder were identified by Money Matters as being the most ethical Kiwisaver fund for the year 2021. And yet, after they'd got that award, they were coming back and admitting to us in private that, in fact, they weren't ethical, and they were starting to take steps to do it. There were certain other problems with Pathfinder, particularly in the reporting process that I'll talk about later. But that's the process of validation. The moral domain, it's made up of fundamental humanitarian principles. This takes the notion particularly from the Norwegians, but if we look at the United Nations Charter, it's talking about very fundamental humanitarian principles that the UN has agreed to in order to try and reduce the outbreak of war. If you look at the laws like the Human Rights Act, the Animal Welfare Act, the Wildlife Act, the Animal Welfare Act defines animals in a very wide sense to have sentient, the ability to be of sentience, and that means having feelings and thinking abilities. Dolphins are quite intelligent animals. And the Wildlife Act talks about other parts of the non-human world where we as New Zealanders have responsibilities and obligations to look after the wildlife. There are conventions and agreements, international convention agreements. Many of these are on the Department of Conservation or the Ministry. It might be the Ministry, but of International. And an example is the Convention on Biological Diversity, and we've signed up to that and have agreed to take responsibilities for ensuring that there is a diversity that's maintained. We have policies towards trees, kauri, endangered species, the protection of wilderness with national parks. There are codes of conduct, Forestry Stewardship Council certification. And then there's the Māori values of mana orititanga and kai teakitanga, guardianship, stewardship, care. So how do you, these go up to make the web, as it were, of what is considered to be part of what I argue is the moral domain, which is defining the values and the behaviour that follows from that, to look after both other people and to the non-human world. So here are the 4 steps to go through with an ethical investment. What are the fund's values? They need to be comprehensive. They need to include both human-human and human-earth relations. They need to be validated. Referred to the moral domain, they should also identify the Māori values that they take into account. The second step is what you're going to exclude. Do you exclude nuclear weapons, anti-personnel mines, tobacco, fossil fuel companies, human rights abuse? When David Clark identified the 6 default Kiwisaver funds, he said they have to get out of illegal weapons, and they have to get out of legal weapons, and there was another one, which I've just momentarily forgotten, but he didn't mention tobacco and he didn't mention human rights abuses. So I find it really strange that a Labour Party minister could somehow avoid the need to include as critical human rights abuses, because the Labour Party has a long tradition of protecting worker rights as part of that. So it's a very selective exclusion. However, there are a number of funds overseas that don't exclude very much at all. And the reason for that is that they engage. And the best example of shareholder activists are the Interfaith Centre for Corporate Responsibility in the United States. And the really good examples of how they have engaged with some of the really big companies about a variety of values that make up that. It's a religious group made up of Roman Catholic, Protestant and Jewish investors. They have about 100 billion under investment. But if you really want to find out shareholder activism in its best sense, best practice, go to them. Now, the question about whether exclude or whether engage is really tactical. And if you look at the types of investments that are to be excluded, the New Zealand Super Fund got rid of, excluded a lot of fossil fuel companies a number of years ago, not on moral grounds, but on the grounds that in 50 years' time, there were going to be real issues with fossil fuels. But the difficulty is that what's happening at the moment is that the pressure that has gone on, the international pressure to get on the big major oil things like BP and so on, is that they're selling off parts of their enterprise to companies like Economist. Economist is a supporter of the All Blacks and is part of the petrochemical industry, who continue the exploitation. So what you're doing by excluding is simply transferring the problem from one company to another company. Ørsted is a Danish company. In about 10 or so, 20 so years ago, it was a traditional oil fossil fuel company. But they decided then that they would transition to a renewable company, and they're one of the outstanding renewable companies at the moment. So there are some real tactical and difficult issues about whether you're going to exclude and whether you're going to engage. And the last step is how you're going to report. As I've said, in 2 and 3, there's not necessarily rights and wrongs. That's tactical, but it's really important that you tell people who are going to invest in your fund or are looking to invest exactly what you're up to, so they are clear. And if you choose as an ethical principle that you're going to do no harm, then when you report, you should be able to know that of all the investments that the fund is invested in, are they harming? Are they harming people, and are they harming the earth? And if they're not harming the earth, then what kind of engagement, if you're invested in, what kind of engagement have you had and the results? And the really good funds overseas actually report on their engagement and their progress. What I was going to say is that about Pathfinder is that their sustainability report actually made it very difficult to estimate or understand exactly where their investments were causing no harm or not. They actually provided a lot of evidence that was actually irrelevant, and so it's really critical. And this reporting process is very poorly done. So what would I would recommend? I would recommend legislation change for the New Zealand Superannuation Fund and the Crown financial institutions to respect and care for people in the earth. Now, there are different ways of expressing that. That's one. The other changes is that the New Zealand Superannuation Board is limited in the expertise with people in science, social science, ethics, engineering, and Maori knowledge. Why did they do what they did? I mean, if you had somebody with some social science background on the board, they would know about validation. They would know that ESG is just not appropriate. If you just add people to the board without his background, it's too large. So one way is having an independent unit within the New Zealand Superannuation Fund with its own board. They've got a small group there at the moment which provide information to the Earthquake Commission, and I think also the government civil service investment group. The other option is to do what the Norwegians and the Swedes have done, and that's make the assessment of the ethical nature of investments and the engagement with those companies to try and change it where appropriate as a separate organisation. There are pros and cons of that, but I believe that on balance, if you look at trying to have that unit spudded in with the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, if you include the Earthquake Commission, if you include the ACC, that's the AC, the Government Superannuation Fund, if you include public trust, if you include the universities, all the government entities, if you like, then there really is a difficulty, I think, of engaging that unit, engaging within that existing umbrella, and at the same time being independent and transparent. So, Labor Party manifesto: Labor will develop an ethical investment framework for all government-controlled investments, so that New Zealanders know that all the public's shared investments are into things that we can stand proudly behind. Well, as I've shown, there's certainly not the case at the moment. I've put this slide in at the last moment. My basic purpose was really to try and define ethical and see how that was being misused and abused. But I've come in the light of that to just a couple of other wider issues that I can throw in, and it might be useful, Phil, to pick these up in subsequent sessions. I think that the State Services Commission really needs to be much more specific about the ethical responsibility for caring for the earth. There needs to be a code of conduct that is extended to all entities that the government is invested in. For example, Meridian Energy. The government has a majority share in Meridian Energy, and it should be charged with the same code of conduct that applies to Crown entities. And Meridian Energy has had some real problems in terms of ethical behaviour. The other thing is that if the rationale for the New Zealand Super Fund being established is based on the assumption that the current market system will be around then. I mean, it was designed to provide a nest egg when the New Zealand population moved to a percentage of people being much elderly and therefore more dependent on a smaller number of people earning the money and paying the taxes. And it's anticipated that about 2035, 36, that'll start to be drawn on. But if you look at the moment of the impact of COVID, and if you look at the impact of Ukraine, and if you look at the droughts, fires, floods in Europe, Pakistan, China, parts of the United States, parts of Africa and Pantanal in South America, those really, you have to say that the ability to be able to run business as usual economics when this is happening, and it's only just going to get worse, really questions a major question about the ability to actually have that nest egg in 10 or so years' time. And the other thing I would throw in is look at the behaviour of the rich in terms of bolt holes. It was reported at the Davis Economic Forum in 2015 that 3,000 millionaires left Chicago, 7,000 left Paris, 5,000 left Rome. The Robert Johnson, the former director of the Soros Fund, told them that many hedge fund managers are buying farms in places like New Zealand with private jets ready to take off. Many have built high-tech underground bunkers. Now, you can disagree with the philosophy, but you can be damn sure that the rich are concerned about protecting their nest egg. And when they start to do that sort of thing, you know that business as usual and we're in real trouble. So in conclusion, New Zealand has a well-established use of ethical to include human and human earth responsibilities in its moral domain, humanitarian principles, laws, codes of conduct, etc. The current behaviour of most Kiwisaver funds and the New Zealand Super Fund is unethical. I haven't done a big study on the Earthquake Commission, but I would also want to include them. What they're doing, what the current problem with the Kiwisaver funds and the New Zealand Super Fund, Crown financial institutions, is inconsistent with government emissions, such as the efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emission and the related initiatives in terms of species protection and so on. If the Financial Markets Authority needs to define ethical for those Kiwisaver funds claiming to be ethical, which includes the 4 steps with reference to New Zealand's moral domain. That needs to be extended to all Kiwisaver funds. I did a quick survey a few weeks or so ago. The majority of Kiwisaver funds claim to be ethical in some form or other, but it may well be that the Financial Markets Authority cannot say that all Kiwisaver funds have to be ethical without a change of legislation. And I've set out some changes that I think the Crown financial institutions need to, there needs to be changes to that so that we can stand proudly behind those. And I think it's time that we woke up.
Nice one, Robert. Okay, thank you, Robert. Can we take the screen down and bring in the community who are on tonight? And we're open for questions. People, if you'd like to have a question, please put your hand, use the little old reactions button at the bottom of the screen and put your yellow hand up. That'd be great.
I'm sorry, it took a little bit longer than I was intending. Sorry about that.
Now that was really good, Robert. Thank you so much. There's a lot of work you've gone on behind what you presented tonight. Ralph, you've got a question. Put your mic, take your mute off, Ralph.
How's that?
That's good.
Thank you very much, Robert, and to you, Phil, for chairing. So as you went through it, what I thought was a very interesting and valuable presentation. Yeah, a lot of questions kept occurring. For example, I recently sent an email to the chair of ACC, who is Steve Mahari, ex-Labor Party minister, and I haven't heard back yet, but questioning the integrity of some of the investments that ACC makes. But it does occur to me that all these government agencies or quasi-government agencies should be, applying a consistent set of principles, and we shouldn't, as investors or beneficiaries of government crown entities, we shouldn't have to be picking them off one by one to point out their deficiencies. There should be a consistent government policy which really does push out the boat a little bit. And I was a little disappointed to hear what you said about the response of some government ministers. And I suspect the officials that are advising the ministers are making some decisions on the fly and giving not very good advice to ministers, to David Clark, for example. And so, what do we do to really get a consistent and high level, high quality set of advice going to ministers and get some decisions which apply across the board, to ACC and lots of other places, about environmental sustainability and all the rest?
Well, I think that you need to be aware that the wise response complaint to the Financial Markets Authority was never actually replied to. And in the end, we asked them what they were going to do about that complaint, and they said, well, we're going to file it and take note of it in the future. And that was, it went to them. It went to them in October last year, or went to Cinder, and that was a public document, and it was passed on and it was dealt with a month later. So what I would say is, I think that if you are a member of an organisation of any kind that is concerned about these issues, be it an environmental group or a human rights group or a religious group or whatever, you should be getting in touch with Dougal McTavish, who's the Secretary of Wise Response, and linking up with him, and then independent. You might write independently, but you can ensure that it's not just Wise Response, it's actually starting to make a groundswell. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is this has been taped, send it out wide and loud so that the more people who know about this stuff, then they're empowered to do something. And
yeah,
you may
thank you.
I
would agree with all that. And I'd just add that 350.org is doing good work in this space, which I've been working with. Yeah.
Sure, but they've got a part of the dilemma with Wise 350 is there are times where exclusion is not the answer. And the example that I gave in terms of Orsted, there are times where you, BP, for example, has sold a lot of its activities, operations in Canada, but it's just been picked up by an oil head in Alberta, and he's just continuing the operations that BP did. So there was an article in the Financial Times about the middle of last year, which talked about 142 billion being spent or sold by the major biggies, but being picked up by private operators and other public operators who just continue business as usual. So exclusion is at times, I think, just too simplistic. It has to be more nuanced.
Yes, Yazdi, you've got a question. Yazdi, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah. Robert Howell, your talk is very good, but and you said that we should try to tell others, etc. But can we have a copy of your talk today so that we can have it on our reference, so that on which we can discuss it with other people, or something to fall back on to read it, so ourselves, because we would have obviously, after you made all sense, absolutely, it actually boils up my blood. But the thing is that just a copy. How do we get it, please? Thank you.
Okay, well, it will be, it's been recorded and it will be available in what, a day or two, Phil?
Yes, it'll be up on the website,
Thank you very much.
the Fabian website. And a copy of the PowerPoint will be as well.
Ask Robert a question because Phil has instructed me. Hello, Phil.
Paul
Here, and I'm just at the, I've got the Eden Park branch of the Labor Party sitting around me, who are a very rowdy lot, to be honest. And in the pub, we're all, you'll notice here, there's a couple of rowdies. And just asking Robert a question, we're at a branch meeting, what's the best thing a branch could do in the Labor Party to assist this? Should we take a motion to the LEC that looks to promote your position?
Well, the first thing for all LECs is that I think that they should see the load. You should refer as many people as you can to see this, so they're informed. Secondly, talk about it to your MP. Thirdly, there are some remits that Kaiparaki Maharangi LEC took to the Auckland Northland Regional Council dealing with some of these issues. So hopefully it will come up at national conference. And I would say, write to David Clark and Grant Robinson and Jacinda. The more MPs that know about it, the better.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. That's great. Is that your question, Paul?
Yeah, thank you.
I think you're muted.
No, you're okay. You're muted now. Are there further questions? Robert, it seems to me that in a small country like New Zealand,
Sorry. That's Di's daughter. Hey.
Hello, Anna.
I'll give her a lift.
Sorry, Paul, control your meeting. Ralph, you've got your hand up again. Is it you or Philippa that's got the question?
You're muted.
You're muted, Robert. Ralph.
Yeah, he's got.
Sorry about that, guys.
It's okay. Yes, I was wanting to raise a more positive example. I'm on the board of Kaingora, which is the largest crown company in New Zealand. And it's been set up in a different way in terms of having long-term funding so that we can do urban regeneration as well as building a large number of necessary houses. And the Minister of Finance and Minister of Housing has enabled us to raise wellbeing bonds and sustainability bonds, which are up to $8 billion, and that enables us to not have to go annually to Treasury, but we have to justify what these bonds do, and so we have to describe the building of the housing is affordable, explain what social housing is, and show that we're trying to reduce carbon emissions, and we choose the sites of the housing so that they're close to public transport, and so that there's the kind of range of values of social well-being, environmental well-being, and so forth are evidently there, and we have to justify them. And those bonds are bid for very avidly every year. So it enables us to have a certainty that over a long period we can not just build new homes, but fulfill the healthy home standards and retrofit houses that were left to go mouldy for quite a while. So that's another way of positively starting and saying this is what we're doing and this is who we're buying from and this is what we will do in return. And I should say I wrote an article about it for the public health blog about that. I wrote it for The Conversation, and the Australians decided it was too political and they wouldn't publish it because they have the editorial thing in that. But I would suggest, you know, I found that a really interesting presentation, Robert, and I wonder if something like The Conversation, which Rafe published something and it gets linked all around the world and it has millions of hits. So,
I think you have to be a active academic, and I'm retired at the moment. But if there are any academics, I perhaps should talk with Liz, who's the chair of Wise Response. Perhaps we can do it jointly. Look, thanks for the example. There are there are some Kiwisaver funds that are doing quite well, but they're not doing well enough. But I would mention Amana, which is a Islam-based Kiwisaver fund. And that's really quite interesting to look at because it does not invest in any banks because of the usury aspect. But I would say if you are in a Kiwisaver fund, then go to the Simplicity case study on the Wise Response website and read that and go to section 2.3, which has a list of questions that you can go through to identify whether that fund is valid or not. Use that framework and say to your fund, look, this is what you should be doing. You should be using that and following the 4 steps. So each of us at an individual level can engage with a fund and push them. But there's other, as you've mentioned, there are other examples which I think are worthy of applaud as well.
Robert, in your investigations, have you come across any funds or individuals maybe who would argue, you know, the sort of the capitalist slam dunk on all of this, which is okay, we'll come out of that, but you won't get as much in your superannuation fund, and you'll have less to live on as an old age pensioner. So, have you come across people who are using that sort of crude argument, that really straight up optimization of shareholder returns stuff?
A Quaker friend in the United States sent me a newspaper cutting about the current Florida governor who is saying he's ordering all his state pension funds to get out of ESG framework. Okay, so they are around. I'm not sure about Milford. I just haven't investigated that. The majority of, what's interesting is that over the last year or two, ESG has become the flavour of the month, and there's a recognition now that you have to do something about it. The problem is that the majority of people in the financial world for decades saw ethical, environmental and social issues as a limit on the profits that you could make. Now there's lots of studies to show that that assumption is not justified. But when they come to then saying, well, here's a business opportunity to do ESG. Now that's why you've got so many different varieties, because the consultants, et cetera, are wanting to jump on the bandwagon with their version of what ESG is. And ESG is rubbish. It simply says you need to take into account environment, social, and governance factors. But what are the bad governance things that you should be avoiding, or the good ones that you should be promoting? It doesn't define that. But you will certainly you'll certainly get that. But I think yes.
So my interest, we you know the term greenwashing. Well, there should be a certain amount of ethics washing going on, and that's becoming a prevailing narrative as opposed to the more crude capitalistic narrative. And it's likely to take the edge off some of the outrage that people should be feeling. And yet we've just got to see through it and call it for what it is, ethics washing, and take the steps that you're recommending.
Well, I agree. The security SEC, I think is Security Exchange Commission, which is the equivalent of the Financial Markets Authority, which is the watchdog to ensure that companies are honest in terms of their activities and their promotion and stuff, has taken funds. They have prosecuted them and fined them. The ACCR, the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility that I founded about 10 years ago, right, when I was in Canberra, have taken, I think it's Santos, to the equivalent of the FMA in Australia. The Europeans have also been pretty active in trying to reduce greenwash as well. But I think the fundamental issue is that the professionals in the regulatory bodies and in the investing bodies simply do not have the appropriate background to be able to recognise what you mean by ethics, and they define it like whatever they like. And it's if you read the latest report by the New Zealand Superannuation Fund about responsible investment, it really is, I just think, sad. It's superficial, and that's because those board members don't have the appropriate background. Put somebody like Dame Salmon on the board. She was on the board for the environmental group, for the environmental committee for Air New Zealand. Put her on, and people like that. People who have wide background experience and wisdom, and they bring a much wider perspective of knowledge of the social sciences and are able to identify the values accordingly. So people like Anne Salmon and others, I think.
Mike Joy. Mike Joy.
Yeah. Well, but you need somebody. You need somebody there who is able to say, look, if you're doing that, you're actually up against the science. Engineering. I mean, I think somebody like Jack Woodward there. I mean, Jack's got a broad humanitarian perspective, but he's also, even though he's been retired for a while, he's pretty smart in terms of what's going in engineering. And some of the engineers really, the engineers for social responsibility are up to a lot of this stuff, but are they there? No.
Yes, I agree with you, and my compliments to your career and your history, Jack. It's been a marvellous contribution. Thank you very much. Are there any further questions from the group? Well, I'd like to thank you, Robert, for the work and effort that you've put into the presentation tonight. It's a building project, and it does need to gather momentum, and it does need to catalyst out from us, out from what you're saying into other activists like would be on this meeting, so that they all take the steps and actions that they can in the context that they've got to be able to do the things that you can do, whether it's about remits or whether it's about lobbying or whether it's about writing letters. It's all about making this message stick that we do have a moral domain and we expect our citizens to live up to it. And I'd really like to thank you for the work and effort you've put in, and ask everyone to show their appreciation if they can, with a wave and a clap. I know most people are on mute, but we'll just do a wave, Robert. Thank you very much.